I only heard the scream, just one scream, and then silence. After that, nothing was ever the same again. Those were the words of a neighbor who stood frozen behind police tape, watching the flashing lights reflect off rain-soaked pavement. Inside the house on Mulberry Road, officers would find more than just a crime scene. Blood on the walls, broken furniture, a cellar door left ajar, and a silence that seemed too heavy for any home. This wasn't just a murder. This was a family war, long brewing, deeply buried, and now finally erupted in the most violent way imaginable. You're watching Crime Chronicles Confidential, where the truth buried beneath every crime is brought to light. It was 2:47 a.m. when the silence of Smethwick's suburban streets was shattered by a single, piercing scream. It came from number 41, a semi-detached house that looked no different from the others. White walls, a small garden, and curtains that always stayed drawn. But that night, something behind those curtains broke. Mrs. Eliza Thompson, who lived across the street, was the first to call the police. In her trembling voice, she reported hearing a woman screaming as if her soul was being torn apart, followed by the sound of glass breaking and what she thought were heavy footsteps running through the house. She didn't know who lived there exactly. A quiet family, she told dispatch. Pakistani, I think, kept to themselves. Within minutes, police cars arrived, their lights casting eerie red and blue flashes across the wet asphalt. Officers approached cautiously. The front door was closed, but unlocked. As they stepped inside, the air felt thick, like something terrible had happened just moments before. The hallway was in disarray. A shattered vase lay near the stairs. Blood droplets trailed toward the kitchen. And upstairs, in the far left bedroom, the bed was overturned, the mattress on the floor, and a child's drawing pinned to the wall had been partially torn. Neighbors started gathering outside, some in robes, some holding umbrellas, all whispering the same thing: what happened? No one had expected violence in that house. No one had imagined that such a well-maintained home could be hiding so much rage. As officers moved deeper into the property, a strange quiet returned, unnatural and heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The back door was ajar, and muddy footprints led toward the garden, then stopped abruptly near the shed. A dog barked in the distance, the only sound in an otherwise frozen moment. Detectives would later describe that first night as one of eerie contradiction. So peaceful on the outside, and yet a storm had clearly passed through the inside. But what disturbed them most wasn't just the signs of struggle. It was the absence of any people. No bodies. No suspects. Just signs of violence and one undeniable truth. Something or someone was missing. And that scream? It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Smethwick for months to come. When officers first stepped into the house, they expected a routine domestic disturbance. Maybe a fight that had gotten out of hand. But as their boots touched the cold tiled floor, they knew this was something darker. Blood wasn't just a trace. It was a presence. Smears on the staircase banister, droplets leading toward the kitchen, and a handprint on the wall near the living room, as if someone had reached out in desperation. The living room was chaotic. Upturned furniture, a shattered photo frame, a child's toy car half melted from what looked like heat damage. There were signs of struggle, but also something else, something deliberate. Drawers pulled open and left empty. Cushions sliced open, as if someone had been searching for something. But what? Then there was a hallway closet, locked from the outside. It was an odd thing. A heavy wooden door, bolted shut with a padlock that didn't match the rest of the house. One officer asked the obvious. Why would anyone padlock a closet from the outside in their own home? They would find the answer, eventually, but not that night. Upstairs, things were even stranger. The main bedroom was untouched. Perfectly made bed. Framed verses from the Quran on the wall. A faint scent of rose oil still lingered in the air. But the next room, what looked like a guest bedroom, told a different story. Blood on the sheets, a cracked mirror, and a single woman's sandal lying near the window. But it was the last door at the end of the hall that froze everyone. It was locked, not just shut, but locked from the inside. They knocked. No answer. They called out. Nothing. One officer forced it open. Inside was a small room, bare walls, a twin mattress on the floor, no windows, and in the center, a spiral notebook. Its pages were torn, scribbled with frantic handwriting, half in Urdu, half in English. There were names, dates, accusations, a desperate voice preserved in ink. That notebook belonged to Ayesha, the missing daughter-in-law, and though she wasn't there, her words echoed through the room like a ghost. She had written about fear, control, secrets the family wouldn't speak of in public, about a brother-in-law who watched too closely, a husband who changed after marriage, and a mother-in-law who believed silence was the only way to survive. This wasn't just a house. It was a vault. Every room had a different truth seal behind it. And that night, as police walked back down the stairs, one thing became clear. Someone in that family had been preparing for this moment for a long, long time. The Khan family had lived in Smethwick for nearly 2 decades. On the surface, they were the portrait of stability. The patriarch Malik Khan had immigrated from Pakistan in the late 90s, building a small grocery business that eventually flourished into a chain of convenience stores. His wife, Shireen, was known in the community for her charity work and modesty. Their home was always spotless, their children well-dressed, their smiles rehearsed. But what outsiders saw was only the skin of a story that had been rotting underneath for years. The family was large, 3 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest, Amir, was groomed to take over the family business. He was responsible, quiet, and obedient until he married Ayesha. The middle son, Shoaib, was the opposite, fiery, impulsive, and constantly in competition with his elder brother. The youngest, Bilal, kept his distance, often away at university, unaware or pretending to be, of the daily tension at home. Then there was Alina, the only daughter, beautiful, sheltered, and painfully silent. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her presence in the house was like a painting, visible, admired, but untouched. From the outside, they were united, but within the walls of 41, Mulberry Road, loyalties were shifting. Amir and Ayesha had grown distant from the rest. They lived upstairs, rarely joining family dinners. Shoaib resented them both, blaming Ayesha for the Cold War that now defined the household. And Shireen, the mother, struggled to maintain the illusion of peace, caught between sons, tradition, and the fear of a crumbling reputation. Tensions flared quietly but consistently, through glances, through whispers behind closed doors, through silence that lingered too long. Ayesha had once confided to a neighbor that the house felt like walking on glass in the dark. Malik Khan, the father, had stopped coming home regularly, spending more nights at his corner shop than with his family. Perhaps he knew what was happening. Perhaps he chose to ignore it. And while no one had yet disappeared and no crime had officially been committed, there was something deeply wrong, something invisible but ever-present, like pressure building under the surface of the earth. The Khans were not one family. They were 5 people bound by blood, living like strangers, pretending everything was fine, until it wasn't. Amir and Shoaib Khan were born just 3 years apart, growing up as brothers often do, inseparable in childhood, fiercely competitive in adolescence, and eventually bitter in adulthood. As boys, they played cricket in the alley behind their house, shared bunk beds, and fought over who got the last piece of roti at dinner. But as they grew older, their paths diverged in ways that would set them on a slow, inevitable collision course. Amir, the eldest, carried the weight of expectation. From a young age, he was a responsible one, the son who helped his father with bookkeeping, who stayed quiet in family arguments, who never stepped out of line. He was groomed to be the heir, not just of the business, but to the family's reputation. His future was mapped out before he even had a chance to dream. Shoaib, on the other hand, was unpredictable, charismatic, hot-headed, and fiercely independent. He didn't want to follow anyone's path, not his father's, and especially not Amir's. He struggled with the feeling of always being second, always compared. And even when he did something right, it was never quite enough. The real fracture began when Amir married Ayesha. She was educated, opinionated, and carried herself with quiet strength. Shoaib saw her not just as a woman who had married his brother, but as an outsider who disrupted the family's delicate balance. Ayesha didn't bend to traditions the way their mother had. She questioned decisions. She wanted privacy. and she encouraged Amir to pull away from the family's collective control. Shoaib took it personally. He felt Amir was abandoning them, changing, and with that change came distance. The late-night conversations disappeared. Arguments replaced brotherly teasing. Even their mother noticed it. She once said during a family dinner, "You two used to be like one soul. What happened?" What happened was jealousy, silent, corrosive, and growing. Shoaib believed Amir had everything handed to him. The family business, their father's approval, and now a wife who seemed to worship him, while Shoaib scraped to prove himself. Amir only had to show up. Tension turned to coldness. Coldness turned to confrontation. They no longer saw each other as brothers. They saw each other as obstacles. In the days before the scream shattered the silence on Mulberry Road, neighbors reported hearing raised voices at night, furniture being moved. Something slammed hard against the wall. One even claimed to hear the phrase, "You're going to ruin everything," shouted more than once. What began as sibling rivalry had turned into something else, something darker, a silent war within a family already on the edge. And as the pressure built, it wasn't a question of if something would break. It was only a matter of when. Ayesha had always been somewhat distant from the rest of the Khan family. She kept to herself, stayed upstairs with Amir most of the time, and rarely participated in the loud, crowded gatherings that filled the house. So when she wasn't seen for a day or two, no one found it unusual, at least not at first. But it wasn't just one day. It became 2, then 3, and then nearly a week. And still, no one reported her missing. Not her husband, not her in-laws, not even Shoaib, who had often been quick to point fingers in the past. When asked later, the family would give vague answers. She went to visit her cousin, or she needed some space. But there was no cousin, and Ayesha never left without telling someone, especially not without her handbag, her clothes, or her phone charger, all of which were still in the bedroom she shared with Amir. What made the situation more chilling was that Amir had continued with life as though nothing was wrong. He went to work. He returned home. He answered calls. And when the police eventually asked him where Ayesha was, he calmly replied, "She needed time away. We had an argument. She left." But then something happened that cracked the story open. On the 5th day of her disappearance, Ayesha's mobile phone, which had been unreachable since the night of the scream, suddenly pinged. It connected to a cell tower just 3 blocks away from the Khan home for exactly 11 minutes, and then went dark again. The signal didn't come from a moving car or a train. It was stationary, fixed, as if someone had turned it on, checked something, then shut it off. Police traced the location to an alley behind an abandoned bakery. They searched the area but found nothing. No phone, no fingerprints, no camera footage. Just an empty space that felt like a message had been sent, then carefully erased. That brief signal raised more questions than answers. If Ayesha had left, why hadn't she contacted anyone? Why had her phone been silent for so long? And most importantly, who had it now? Whispers began to spread in the neighborhood. Ayesha's friends quietly asked if she was okay. A former university classmate sent a message to her social media, which remained unread. Her last post was over a week old, a photo of her garden with a caption that read, "Growth only happens in sunlight." But there was no sunlight left in that house. And for detectives, the absence of concern from the people who should have cared the most became the loudest alarm of all. A woman was missing, and the people closest to her were acting like she had never existed. It was a routine search, the kind that detectives carry out when something doesn't feel right. The Khan house had already offered enough red flags, blood traces, a missing woman, conflicting stories. But it was the unfinished basement that kept pulling at their instincts. A door at the back of the kitchen led to a narrow staircase, poorly lit, with walls that smelled of damp concrete, and something else. Something harder to describe. At the bottom of the stairs, amid old paint cans and broken furniture, stood a blue industrial barrel. It didn't belong. It was too large, too clean, and out of place in a basement otherwise coated in dust. One officer tapped the lid. It echoed back with a hollow thud. When they opened it, the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside was a thick, chemical-smelling liquid, murky, acidic, and clinging to the surface like oil. Floating just beneath was what appeared to be fabric. Then a human hand. Pale, swollen, unrecognizable. The forensic team was called in within minutes. The house was sealed off. The blue barrel was carefully removed and taken to the lab. What they found inside was a partial human body, an arm, part of a torso, fragments of hair. No face, no legs, no identity that could be confirmed by sight alone. But the ring on the hand told them everything they needed to know. It was a silver band with a tiny inscription on the inside. Ayesha and Amir's wedding date. The news broke the next morning, but the family remained silent. Amir was taken in for questioning, maintaining that he had no knowledge of the barrel, no idea how it got there. Shoaib denied everything. Shireen wept but said nothing of substance. And Malik, the father, didn't return home that night at all. The presence of the blue barrel turned the case from a missing person to a probable homicide. Yet, even then, there was no complete body, no murder weapon, no confession. The horror of the discovery wasn't just in the remains, but in what was missing. Someone had gone to great lengths to dismember, to destroy, to erase. And yet they had left that one piece, one hand, one ring, as if the truth couldn't be buried without at least one part of her still reaching for the surface. It was no longer just about Ayesha. It was about the dark architecture of the home itself. The basement wasn't just beneath the house. It was beneath the lies, the silence, the years of quiet resentment. The blue barrel was a container of secrets. But it was also a warning. Someone in that house wanted to silence a woman who refused to remain invisible. And even in death, she was speaking. It was found tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the upstairs bedroom. Hidden not in panic, but in careful, deliberate secrecy. Ayesha's diary wasn't a colorful journal or a teenage notebook. It was a small, worn, black leather-bound book, its corners frayed, its pages filled in neat, steady handwriting. And what was written inside didn't just speak. It screamed. The diary began months before her disappearance. Page after page documented her days in the Khan household, a place she described not as a home, but as a stage where everyone wore masks. She wrote about isolation, subtle threats, the constant pressure to submit and obey. She wrote about Shoaib, his anger, his intrusion into her private space, the way he watched her from the hallway mirror when he thought she wasn't looking. But most chilling were the entries about Amir, the man who was supposed to love her, protect her. She wrote of how he changed after marriage, how he stopped defending her in front of the family, how his silence became complicity. He doesn't hit me, one entry read, but his silence does something worse. It tells him I am alone. There were entries about the night she tried to leave, the pack bag, the back door, and how Shireen, the mother-in-law, had been waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes cold. "Where will you go?" she had asked. "You'll come crawling back by morning." Ayesha never left that night, but she wrote about it. She wrote about all of it. The final entries were the most fragmented, words trailing off, half sentences, as if she had been interrupted. The last complete page was dated 4 days before her scream was heard. In it, she wrote, "If something happens to me, this is where my truth lives. They'll never let me speak in court, so I speak here." When the police read the diary, it shifted the entire direction of the investigation. It wasn't just about physical evidence anymore. It was about motive, pattern, history. The words painted a portrait of a woman trapped, not just in a house, but in a system of silence enforced by fear, family pride, and cultural shame. Though the diary was never read aloud in court, its contents leaked. Whispers passed from hand to hand, from file to headline. And in every sentence, Ayesha's voice grew louder, refusing to be buried, refusing to be forgotten. She hadn't been silent. She had been writing. And that diary, once hidden beneath the floor, became the loudest testimony in the entire case. Why does a family turn on its own? Why does love curdle into control and silence into violence? In the Khan household, the motive wasn't a single trigger. It was a slow, poisonous blend of honor, control, and fear, brewed over years and finally spilled in one brutal act. Ayesha had threatened the invisible balance. She questioned decisions, resisted old rules, demanded space that was never meant to be hers. In a home where obedience was tradition, her independence was rebellion. She wasn't disrespectful, just unafraid. And that, to the Khans, was the real danger. Honor was a word they never spoke aloud, but it hung in the air like smoke. For Shireen, the mother-in-law, Ayesha's defiance meant the family was losing control. For Shoaib, it meant she was shaming them by influencing Amir, making him less of a man in his eyes. And for Amir himself, the conflict between love and loyalty turned inward until guilt became resentment. Neighbors described Amir as a man who changed over time. Once affectionate, he had become withdrawn, nervous, almost haunted. Perhaps he was torn between the woman he married and the legacy he was meant to uphold. Or perhaps he was simply too weak to choose a side until it was too late. Control played its part like a quiet hand on the shoulder. Ayesha's movements were monitored, her phone checked, her messages questioned. When she tried to work part-time at a local school, arguments followed. She wrote in her diary that every door in the house had a lock, but none of them were hers. And then there was fear, not just Ayesha's, but the family's. Fear of exposure, fear of shame, fear of what the community would say if the truth came out. In a world where family honor was currency, Ayesha's voice was a threat they could no longer afford. The night she disappeared wasn't spontaneous. It was a result of 100 silences, 1,000 glances, and years of pressure pushing toward a single moment. What began as tradition had mutated into control. What looked like family pride was, in fact, fear of losing the illusion of perfection. Ayesha didn't die because of one argument or one mistake. She died because her existence challenged a system built on obedience. And in trying to live her own truth, she collided with a world that still believed silence was survival. That collision wasn't just fatal. It was inevitable. In the days following Ayesha's disappearance, the neighborhood of Mulberry Road transformed. What was once a quiet street filled with routine and politeness turned into a zone of murmurs, locked gazes, and late-night conversations behind curtains. The Khan house stood like a scar, visible, unspoken, yet constantly watched. Neighbors who had once exchanged only smiles now began to remember things. Details that hadn't seemed important until they were forced into the light. One woman recalled seeing Ayesha in the garden weeks before, staring blankly at the sky, watering plants that had already died. Another mentioned overhearing arguments through thin brick walls, voices rising, objects breaking, followed by long, heavy silences. But it wasn't just what they heard. It was what they ignored. There had been more than one scream. The one that woke the street was simply the last. Before that, there were muffled cries, rushed footsteps in the middle of the night, and the sound of someone sobbing behind closed windows. A delivery man admitted that Ayesha had once opened the door with red marks on her wrist. She smiled, he said, but her eyes didn't. And yet no one said anything. No one called. No one knocked. Some out of fear, some out of cultural respect. It's a family matter, they told themselves. Others simply convinced themselves it wasn't their place. They weren't sure. They didn't want to be wrong. So they stayed silent. But after the discovery of the blue barrel, after forensic vans arrived and news cameras followed, the silence became unbearable. Suddenly, everyone had something to say. They remembered things. They replayed sounds in their heads. They imagined what could have happened if someone, anyone, had stepped in sooner. A teenager across the street confessed she once recorded a video from her window after hearing shouting. She deleted it. She didn't want trouble. We thought they were just fighting, she said. All couples do, right? Only now did it become clear. It wasn't just a scream that went unheard. It was a life, a series of warning signs that had flickered like faulty lights. But in a neighborhood trained to mind its own business, those flickers were dismissed as background noise. Ayesha had cried out long before she vanished, and though the walls remembered her, the people didn't listen until it was far too late. The turning point in the investigation didn't come from a confession or a witness. It came from data, cold, silent, and undeniable. When police obtained phone records and location history from Amir and Shoaib's mobile devices, they expected patterns, maybe even inconsistencies. What they didn't expect was a single, seemingly minor GPS error that would unravel a crucial lie. Amir had maintained from the beginning that he was at work the night Ayesha disappeared. He said he had stayed late at the store, gone for tea with a supplier afterward, and returned home after midnight. His story was calm, measured, almost too precise. Shoaib's version supported it. He wasn't even home, he said. He couldn't have done anything. But when detectives reviewed Amir's phone location data, something didn't add up. His GPS record showed a consistent signal near the family store until 10:42 p.m. After that, there was a gap. His phone didn't ping again until 12:13 a.m. near Mulberry Road. Initially, the gap seemed like a technical glitch. Phones can lose signal. Batteries die. But then came the mistake. At exactly 11:06 p.m., a single GPS ping registered. Not from his home or the store, but from an alley 2 streets away. It was a brief signal, just 7 seconds, but it placed Amir's phone near an old service entrance behind the bakery, the same location where Aisha's phone had briefly connected days earlier. When confronted, Amir claimed it was impossible. Maybe someone took my phone, he said. Maybe it was in my car and someone borrowed it. But surveillance footage from a nearby petrol station captured him alone, driving his own car at 10:50 p.m., heading toward that area. And there was more. His call history showed a 3-minute phone call to Shoaib at 11:12 p.m., the same time frame as the alley ping. What they discussed remains unknown. The call wasn't recorded, but its timing suggested coordination, or at least communication, during a critical moment. The GPS mistake was minor, invisible to the naked eye, but devastating under forensic scrutiny. Amir hadn't expected his phone to briefly connect. He thought the alley was a dead zone. He thought his silence was enough to protect him. But technology didn't care about silence. It remembered everything. That single ping placed Amir at the heart of a cover-up. It contradicted his alibi. It aligned with the window of Aisha's presumed death. And it proved that even the smallest signal could echo louder than any denial. In the end, it wasn't just blood or fingerprints that betrayed him. It was a phone in his pocket, a GPS chip, and a brief moment when the digital world refused to lie. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from routine proceedings, but the heavy, breath-held kind that settles when something irreversible is about to happen. Shoaib Khan sat in the witness box, his hands clenched, his eyes lowered. For days, he had denied everything, smirking, deflecting, hiding behind technicalities and half-truths. But now, the pressure had caved in. He was no longer the brother playing victim, the man claiming ignorance. He was the last wall between truth and justice. And when the prosecutor laid out the evidence, Aisha's diary, the GPS logs, the blood traces, the family dynamics, the timeline, there was nothing left to hide behind. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, Shoaib said the words that would shatter the courtroom. I did it. I hit her. I put her in the barrel. I didn't plan it, but I did it for honor. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The judge didn't flinch. The jurors looked frozen, some visibly shaken. Amir, seated nearby, closed his eyes. Shireen, the mother, wept without sound. There was no outburst, just a suffocating stillness as Shoaib confessed, not just to the killing, but to the reason behind it. She disrespected us, he continued. She disrespected my mother, my brother, our traditions. She wanted to leave. She said she would take everything. She wasn't one of us anymore. It wasn't rage that drove him. It was something colder, calculated shame wrapped in the illusion of dignity. But the courtroom wasn't a place for illusions. It was a place where words had weight. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. You claim you did this for honor, he said. But there is no honor in fear. No honor in silence. No honor in killing a woman for wanting to live her life. What you call honor, the law calls murder. And what your community must now understand is this. No tradition, no pride, no fragile masculinity justifies the taking of a life. His words echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. Media outlets repeated them. Social workers quoted them. Activists marched with them written on banners. It became a national reckoning. Shoaib was sentenced to life in prison. Amir received 10 years for aiding in the disposal of the body and obstructing justice. Shireen was not charged but left the city within weeks, never to be seen again. But the confession was more than an admission. It was a mirror, a reflection of a mindset that still believed silence was loyalty and control was love. That day in court, the mirror cracked, and through it, the country saw what it had long refused to look at. A family didn't just break the law. It broke the soul of someone who dared to live outside its rules. Shireen Khan sat in the back row of the courtroom every day, dressed in black, her eyes hidden beneath a scarf, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She never cried openly. She never spoke to press. But behind her silence lay a story just as complicated as the one unfolding on the stand. In the months leading up to Ayesha's death, Shireen had been more than a witness. She had been a participant in an environment that allowed it to happen. She wasn't the one who struck the fatal blow, but her silence, her expressions, her passive nods, all shaped the unspoken rules of the household. She had seen Ayesha with bruises. She had heard the arguments. She had walked past that locked guest room without asking questions. There was one evening, recounted later by a neighbor, when Ayesha stood at the front gate, bag in hand, shaking as if she were about to leave. Shireen had stood beside her, whispering, gripping her wrist. Ayesha didn't leave that night. She went back inside. No one knows what was said between them, but the message was clear: stay and keep quiet. In her culture, Shireen had been raised to believe that a daughter-in-law's defiance was a threat to the family's name, that patience, silence, and endurance were virtues for women, that to intervene in her son's actions would be disloyal. So she chose not to see. She chose not to hear. Even as her home darkened, even as her sons moved deeper into anger, she convinced herself that this was a phase, a storm that would pass. But it didn't pass. And when it broke, she was left standing at the center of the wreckage. Police questioned her, and she claimed she knew nothing. "I thought she had left," she said. "We argued sometimes. But I never thought." Her voice trailed off. No charges were filed against her. Legally, she had done nothing. But morally, the silence was deafening. Some called her a mother torn between love and truth. Others called her complicit. Was her silence a crime? Or was it the only defense she had in a world that never taught her to speak? In the aftermath, her presence became symbolic, not of malice, but of every parent who looks away when faced with uncomfortable truths, of every woman who has been conditioned to prioritize family reputation over another woman's safety. Shireen disappeared from the public eye after the trial, but her silence lingers long after the verdict, long after the cameras left. It lingers as a question no one can quite answer. What would have changed if she had spoken just once? It was discovered days after the trial had ended, buried deep within a forgotten voicemail inbox. Ayesha's phone, though never fully recovered, had backed up fragments to her cloud account. One of those fragments was a single audio message, 34 seconds long, sent just hours before her final scream. The recipient was her childhood friend, Zara, someone she hadn't spoken to regularly in years. At 10:39 p.m., Ayesha had press record. Her voice trembled, like she was whispering in fear, but desperate to be heard. "If anything happens to me, please tell them I tried," she said. "I wanted to leave, I really did. But I kept thinking maybe things would change. They didn't. It's not safe here anymore. I don't know what's going to happen tonight. Shoaib said something about teaching me a lesson. I don't think Amir will stop him this time." There was a pause. You could hear her breathing, uneven and shallow. "I'm scared, but if you get this, tell my parents I love them. And tell my little sister, tell her not to be quiet like me." Then the recording ended. No goodbye, just silence. Zara never heard it in time. Her number had changed, and the message was buried under a flood of old spam notifications. It wasn't until investigators combed through Ayesha's cloud data that the voicemail surfaced, a ghost final whisper, arriving far too late. That message played in the courtroom once, during a private hearing. Those who listened couldn't speak afterward. It wasn't just a recording. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark, unanswered. The message revealed what no testimony could. Ayesha knew. She sensed what was coming. And in her final moments, She didn't reach for revenge. She reached for remembrance. It wasn't just evidence. It was a farewell, a warning, and perhaps, most painfully, a plea for someone to care before it was too late. But no one listened in time. And by the time her voice was finally heard, it belonged to memory, not to hope. The court delivered its verdict. Shoaib was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Ayesha Khan. Amir received 10 years for aiding in the cover-up. The family home was sealed, and the blue barrel became an exhibit, cold, metallic, and forever linked to the story that haunted Smethwick. On paper, justice had been served. But for those who knew Ayesha, who had seen her smile before it dimmed, who had read her words and heard her last voice, something still felt painfully unfinished. The sentence may have ended the legal chapter, but the emotional book remained wide open. Was this justice, or just closure? Her parents, flown in from Pakistan for the trial, stood at the courthouse steps holding a photo of their daughter. They didn't speak to the press. They didn't smile. Her mother simply held the frame to her chest like a wound. She asked us once, a cousin later shared, why her worth had to be measured in silence. The community, once quiet, had now begun to speak. There were school programs about domestic abuse. Posters in Urdu and Punjabi with helpline numbers appeared on bulletin boards in community centers. Imams delivered Friday sermons about the difference between tradition and tyranny. But all of it came too late for the one woman who needed it most. Some called the trial a victory, for women, for justice, for truth. But others wondered if it was only a symbolic win. A rare case where a body was found, a confession was given, and evidence was irrefutable. What about the women who were never found, who disappear in silence, with no diary, no voicemail, no mistaken GPS? And what about the systems, cultural, legal, domestic, that allowed this to happen? Those remained, quiet, powerful, waiting. Ayesha's story didn't end with a gavel. It ended with a question that still lingers in the corners of every home like hers. Is justice only what the law decides? Or is it the moment when a woman's voice is finally heard and never silenced again? Every family carries secrets. Some are small, unspoken tensions, buried disagreements. Others are deeper, wounds that never fully heal, truths that no one dares to speak aloud. In the Khan household, those secrets didn't just simmer beneath the surface. They boiled over, spilling into violence, silence, and ultimately, tragedy. The war that unfolded in Smethwick wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with words left unsaid, with expectations passed down like heirlooms, with power disguised as protection and love poisoned by control. Ayesha's death wasn't just a result of a single night. It was the outcome of years of emotional erosion, invisible battles, and a culture that confused obedience with virtue. In the aftermath, the house stood empty, the garden overgrown, curtains drawn. But what lingered wasn't just a memory of what happened. It was a reminder that this wasn't an isolated story. It was a reflection of many homes, many families, where silence is mistaken for peace, and where danger wears the face of familiarity. Smethwick's case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't a stranger on the street. It's the person across the dinner table, the one who knows your routine, your weaknesses, your fears, the one who calls it love while holding control. And perhaps that's the hardest war of all, the one we don't see, the one hidden behind smiles and traditions, the one that asks, how many more voices have to vanish before we learn to listen? If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and join us at Crime Chronicles Confidential as we continue to search for truth. Because behind every body, there isn't just a killer. There's a story waiting to be told. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and continue to search for truth with Crime Chronicles Confidential. Because behind every body, there isn't just a killer. There's a story waiting to be told.